Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at chapter 12 of the Ecce textbook titled Capture. And the story for this chapter revolves around Dawes as he leads a group to try to get back the runaway slave named Geta. Now the grammar for this chapter is important because we're going to be returning to the ablative case, which is one that we saw a few chapters ago with prepositional phrases. In this video though, you're going to learn that the ablative can be used outside of prepositional phrases too, and we're going to learn exactly how we use it. To start, we want to look at the vocabulary, and remember we're looking at derivatives to try to connect this Latin vocabulary back to our daily lives in English. To start, we want to look at the word invenio invenire. This verb gives us a few English derivatives that are really important. So for instance, we get invent, inventor, inventive, and inventory. Now invenire in Latin means to find, and if you think about that, you can understand these four English words, because they all have to do with finding something. If you invent a new product, you can think of it as finding it for the first time. And if you think of an inventory, that's just a list of items. Usually you're making that list so that you can find them at another time or at a later time. So again, all four of these words in English have to do with that root of finding something. The word bonus means good in Latin. And in English, this leads to the derivatives of bonus, bonanza, bounty, and even bona fide. And remember, all of these have to do with something being good. And if you think of the Romance languages, in Italian, Spanish, and French, you can see the connection here. It's the exact same word, they're stemming from bonus. Convoco convocare means to call together in Latin. And in English, we get the word convocation. And if you think about a convocation, it's a calling of some sort. You're calling a group of people together. It's holding the exact same meaning. Rogo rogare means to ask in Latin. And in English, we get the derivatives interrogate, arrogant, prerogative, derogatory, and surrogate. Now, all of these have to do with asking something. So if you think of interrogating someone, you're grilling them with questions trying to get information. That's the root of all five of these English words. Canis canis is the word for dog in Latin. And from this, we get canine in English, and you can see the connection. Ferro ferre means to bring, and in English we get the words fertile, infer, circumference, suffer, and transfer. And again, if we think about the word fertile, it's talking about the ground being able to bring us crops, is one way of thinking about it. And if you transfer something, it means you're bringing it across. That's literally the definition in Latin. You're bringing something somewhere else. You're transferring it. All five words have the root of bringing. Olfaccio olfacere is a word that you might not think has an English derivative, but it does. It's olfactory. And this is a word that you're not really going to see outside of science class or if you become a doctor in a medical book. But your olfactory sense is your sense of smell. And it holds that same definition in Latin. Olfacere means to smell. And in this chapter, you're going to be learning about dogs who are smelling for Geta. That's where this word will show up. Vestigia are footprints in Latin. And in English, we get the word vestige and vestigial. And both of these have to do with traces or footprints. So if you think of archaeology, if they find a piece of pottery, for instance, that might be called a vestige of an ancient civilization. It's a footprint or a leftover, a trace of that civilization. Vestigial is the word we use again in science class if you think of, for instance, the tail on a human being that isn't there anymore. That's called a vestige or a vestigial tail. It's no longer there. That's where this word comes from. Immobilis means motionless in Latin. And again, we get immobile in English. It holds the same meaning. Traho trahere means to drag in Latin, and it leads to a few interesting English derivatives, such as attract, contract, subtract, retract, and tractor. All of these words are holding that root of dragging something. So if you think of attracting someone, it's almost like you're dragging them towards you. And if you think of a tractor, it's something that can drag something. So if you think of a farm, you know, the tractors they use are dragging something behind them. That's the root of these words. This brings us to the grammar for chapter 12, which is the ablative case. And again, we've seen this case before when we were learning about prepositional phrases. But an ablative case can be used when it's not in a prepositional phrase too. That's what this chapter is all about. So recall, so far we've seen the prepositional phrases can expand the meaning of a sentence. So for instance, if you have Davus sub arboribus sedet, it means Davus sits under the trees. The prepositional phrase here is sub arboribus, under the trees. It's giving us more information about where Davus is sitting. That's the prepositional phrase. And remember, prepositional phrases that show position or location, meaning no movement, or motion away from or out of, these use nouns in the ablative case. So for instance, let's look at a few sentences. Aurelia est in villa, or Aurelia is in the house. Cornelia e rivo currit, which means Cornelia runs out of the river. Both of these sentences have prepositional phrases. So in the first one, we have in villa, which means in the house. And in the second, we have e rivo, which means out of the river. Both of these prepositional phrases are showing motion out of in the last one, or in the first sentence, it's showing position without any movement. So we're using the ablative case in both. And you can recognize the ablative by that long A and long O ending. So when you're using the ablative case in a prepositional phrase, you're often answering the following questions. Where, which in Latin is ubi, from where, which is unde, and with whom, which is quocum. These are the three main questions you're answering whenever you use a prepositional phrase with the ablative case. So for instance, if we go back to the sentences we just saw, Aurelia est in villa. The question you're answering here is Aurelia is where? And the answer of where she is in the house, in villa. The same goes for the second one, Cornelia e rivo currit. The question you're answering here is from where? You're saying Cornelia runs from where? She runs out of the river. It's telling you where she's coming from. This sentence, Marcus cum amicis ridet, means Marcus laughs with friends. And the question you're answering here is with whom? And you want to notice that preposition of cum, which means with in Latin. We're going to see it a lot in this chapter and moving forward in the book. It's always going to take an ablative noun with it. And it's answering the question, with whom? With his friends. We can also use the ablative case without a preposition though. And when we use it without a preposition, the way we translate it most often is with these words in English. By, with, from, in, and on. So you have to write these 5 down and keep them in mind. Whenever you see an ablative without a preposition, or in other words, it's not part of a prepositional phrase, we translate it usually with one of these 5 English words. So for instance, let's look at these examples. We have septima ora, nocte, aestate, and brevi tempore. All 4 of these include nouns in the ablative case. Septima ora means at the 7th hour, and look how we translated it, at. Nocte means at night, aestate means in the summer, and brevi tempore means in a short time or soon. Now you'll notice all 4 of these have the ablative endings. There's a long A, which is first declension, and then there's the E, which is third declension ablative. And again, notice how we're translating it. At the 7th hour, at night, in the summer, and in a short time. All 4 of these examples are answering the question of when something happened. We call this the ablative of time. And the reason for that is because it's telling you the timing of an event. When did it happen? This is the ablative of time. It's the first use we're going to learn of the ablative when it's not part of a prepositional phrase. Look at a few examples. First we have servum baculo verberat. And then we have Davus getam tunica aripit. Now in English, these mean he beats the slave with a stick, and Davus grabs Geta by the tunic. And again, you want to notice the ending on these 2 nouns. Baculo, with its long O ending, is telling you it's a second declension ablative. And tunica, with its long A ending, is telling you it's a first declension ablative. And again, remember, the long vowel is one of the markers that you're seeing the ablative case. Now look how we translate it in English. In the first sentence, we're translating the ablative by saying with a stick. The word with is showing up. In the second, we're translating the ablative by the tunic. Again, with the word by. With and by are two of those 5 words we learned on translating the ablative when there's no preposition there. These 2 sentences are answering the question, by what means and how. So in the first sentence, you're saying, how does he beat the slave? And the answer is, he beats the slave with a stick. The ablative there is giving us more information about the verb werbera. In the second, you're saying, how does Davis grab Geta? Or by what means does Davis grab Geta? And the answer is by the tunic. Again, the ablative is giving us more information about the verb. This is why the ablative case is often called the adverbial case, because it's almost describing a verb and giving you more information about it. This is what we call the ablative of means and instrument. And usually we call it the ablative of means. That's an easier way to think of it, because you're saying by what means or how is someone doing something. So let's take a few more examples. In this sentence we have Marcus magna voce clamat, which means Marcus shouts in a loud voice. And again, we can see the ablative endings in our nouns, magna, which is the adjective, and voce, which means voice. The word magna is using the first declension ablative singular, that long A. And voce, which is a third declension noun, is using that short E, again, 2 ablative endings. And the question that they're answering are in what manner, or how, and again, you can see the overlap here. But one way to think of it is saying Marcus shouts how, or Marcus shouts in what manner. The answer is magna voce. He shouts in a loud voice. The ablative is describing or giving us more information on the verb of clamat. It's saying how he shouts in a loud voice. This is what we call the ablative of manner. You're saying in what manner does something happen? And again, the ablative noun will be the answer, in a loud voice in this sentence. So just a quick recap. This is how we've seen the ablative so far in our book. When you have an ablative with a preposition, meaning it's part of a prepositional phrase, it's showing position or location, meaning no motion, or it's showing motion out of or away from something. And the last use that we just saw in this chapter is it's being used with the word cum, which means with. So someone is accompanying something else. Someone is with something. Another use of the ablative is it's answering these questions, where, from where, or with whom. And again, these 3 questions are when you have an ablative with a preposition. That's what it's answering. Now in this chapter, we've also seen ablatives used without a preposition. So the first one is the ablative of time. This is when the ablative, again without a preposition, is answering the question when. Ablative of means is when the ablative is answering the question by what means does something happen. And the ablative of manner answers the question in what manner does something happen. So remember, whenever you see a noun in the ablative case, it's either 1, going with a preposition, so look for the prepositional phrase. If there's a preposition, it's answering the question where, from where, or with whom. If you see the ablative without a preposition, it's answering the questions of when, by what means or how, or in what manner or how. And again, you'll notice the overlap in those last 2. So now we want to just have a quick recap of all the cases, now that we know more about the ablative. So again, the nominative case is always the subject of the verb. The genitive case is showing possession, and we translate it of. The accusative case is always the direct object of the verb. Now we can expand our definition of the ablative case. When it's with a preposition, meaning it's part of a prepositional phrase, it's showing position or location, motion away from or out of, or it's going with the word with. When it's not in a prepositional phrase, it's showing time, means, or manner. And lastly, we have the vocative case. And remember, that's used when you're directly addressing someone. So now that we've learned more about these cases, you can start to understand their full use in Latin sentences. In particular, in this chapter, we're looking at the ablative case. We've learned it with prepositional phrases. Now you know how to translate it and use it when it's not part of a prepositional phrase. This understanding will let you expand and create more complicated Latin sentences as you move through the book.